Summer, 1945. The war is over. Ships loaded with men in faded uniforms slide quietly toward Europe. They are prisoners no longer, just soldiers returning home with nothing but surrender papers and memories. Camp gates across the United States swing open, trains fill again, and the watchtowers fall silent. But as lists are checked and final convoys depart, somebody notices something unusual. Not everyone wants to leave. In Texas, in Kansas, in the Carolinas, a few prisoners step forward to ask the question no one expected. Can we stay? The officers blink in disbelief. Stay? Stay in the country that defeated them? Why would any prisoner want to remain in the land that held him behind wire? For some, the answer is simple: peace. For others, it's a friendship begun on a farm, or a letter shared with a local church family, or a face glimpsed through the fence that still lingers in their thoughts. America had changed them. Inside the camps, work programs had sent men to harvest crops, build barns, fix roads. They labored side by side with civilians who were curious rather than cruel. They earned small wages, bought coffee and chocolate at the canteen, and discovered that the country they were told to despise was nowhere near the monster they imagined. By the time the fighting stopped in Europe, many prisoners spoke English fluently. They sang American songs, wrote home on Red Cross stationery, and told families in Germany or Italy that not all enemies were enemies. When repatriation orders came, those friendships faced the same fences that once divided war from peace. Some captives feared what waited overseas: bombed cities, missing families, and hunger. Here, they had steady work and people who greeted them by name. A farmer might shake a calloused hand and say, "You did good work for me. If you ever come back, there'll be a place for you here." Simple words, but powerful enough to blur the line between captive and neighbor. And so the question quietly spread through the camps: is it really forbidden to stay? Could a man once called an enemy build a life where he once wore a tag marked PW? No one at the time realized it. But the story of World War II on American soil wasn't ending. It was evolving. What began as captivity was about to become something far more surprising, a new kind of beginning. By the time victory was announced in 1945, the United States was quietly holding more than 400,000 prisoners from Axis armies. They were scattered across the country: the pine forests of Arkansas, the flat fields of Nebraska, the deserts of Arizona. Every corner of America had a camp. Each one looked the same: long rows of wooden barracks, towers at the corners, and a barbed wire fence humming in the wind. For most towns, those camps had appeared almost overnight. Trains pulled in, filled with strangers in worn uniforms, men who, until weeks earlier, had been shoving across Europe under orders to destroy the same country that now fed them. But the shock quickly faded. Farmers needed help. Factories needed hands. And the government, short of labor, decided that keeping prisoners busy was better than keeping them idle. So, under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were given work details. They picked cotton in Texas, chopped timber in Oregon, harvested fruit in California. They earned 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, barely anything, but enough for soap, cigarettes, a little chocolate. In town after town, Americans were surprised. Most guards had expected resentment or sabotage. Instead, they found men who seemed relieved to be anywhere that wasn't a battlefield. One Kansas farmer joked that his prisoner crew worked harder than paid labor. Another offered meals from his own kitchen. It started small extra biscuits, coffee from a thermos, the kind of gestures that grow between ordinary people when fear wears off. Soon, the camps and towns were connected in small, almost invisible ways. Local families brought hymn books for Sunday services. Church choirs sang across the fence at Christmas. Prisoners made toys for nearby children out of scrap wood and wire. Some painted murals on school walls to repay hospitality. By 1946, inspectors from the International Red Cross called America's prisoner program the most humane of the war. And yet, beneath all that normality, something unplanned was happening. The fences still stood, but the distance between captor and captive was shrinking. When the war ended, the official order was simple: send them home. But home didn't mean the same thing anymore. Letters arriving from Germany and Italy spoke of rubble, hunger, and bitterness. Inside the United States, meanwhile, the same prisoners were tasting coffee, hearing swing music on the radio, walking through towns where shop windows glowed bright at night. For many, the contrast was impossible to ignore. A few quietly admitted to guards, "We never knew America was like this." And the guards, perhaps proud, perhaps uneasy, answered, "You weren't supposed to." In the calm that followed the gunfire, what had begun as imprisonment was turning into connection. And as one ship after another prepared to sail east, that quiet connection would force both sides to ask the question that no one had written into any surrender document: what if captivity had already become home? When the war finally ended, the fences no longer hummed with fear. The guards were tired. The prisoners were tired. Everyone simply wanted to go home, whatever home meant now. Railways filled again with troop cars heading east toward ports, every seat occupied by men in faded field jackets and empty expressions. But as departure dates were posted on bulletin boards inside the camps, a quiet unease spread through some of the barracks. Not every man in those rooms wanted to see Europe again. Letters arriving from overseas spoke of cities flattened to ash, of families gone, of refugees walking roads that no longer led anywhere. Many of the older prisoners dreaded going back to nothing. Some had wives or parents who no longer wrote. Others faced suspicion from their own governments for having surrendered alive. In contrast, life inside the American camps had become strangely comfortable. They worked, they ate well, they slept without artillery waking them at night. A few had formed friendships that crossed the wire. Farmers who trusted them with tractors, pastors who invited them to Sunday service, families who sent gifts during holidays. Returning to Europe felt like walking backward into darkness. So, one by one, they began asking questions. Careful, indirect at first. Would there ever be a chance to come back? Most guards laughed it off, thinking it was only talk. But soon, the Red Cross began receiving formal requests for immigration paperwork even before the prisoners had been released. One of those requests came from a man named Karl Becker, a stonemason from Bavaria who had spent 3 years at a camp in Texas. He'd worked for a local rancher, building fences and carving a small chapel near the property. When his transport notice arrived, the rancher drove for miles to plead with the military office. He's no enemy. He's family now. It was futile. Then policy said no prisoner could remain, but it wouldn't always be. For men like Karl, the idea that kindness could follow conquest was almost unimaginable. Yet here it was a country strong enough to trust yesterday's enemy with simple work and friendship. Each ship that sailed carried men eastward, but their hearts tugged west, toward those fields where they no longer felt like captives. Months later, after their official repatriation, a trickle of letters reached American mailboxes, postmarks from Hamburg, from Munich, from the ruins of Rome. Inside, heartfelt notes thanking towns for their hospitality, photos of small families restored, and, often, one quiet sentence written in awkward English. "Someday, if it is possible, I will come back." No one could imprison that wish. It would drift across the Atlantic for years, until peace made room for something brand new, former prisoners returning not as captives, but as neighbors. The years after the war moved quickly. By 1947, America was already building new highways, new homes, and a new life that seemed determined to forget the war ever happened. But across the ocean, letters kept arriving in small-town post offices. Letters written in careful English from men once known only by their prisoner numbers. They asked simple questions. Does the job on your farm still need hands? Would the church still welcome me for Sunday? Could I come back if I pay for the boat myself? At first, nobody believed it could happen. The U.S. Army had strict orders no former prisoner could re-enter without a full review. But America was changing. Factories running at full speed needed skilled labor. Farmers needed builders and mechanics. Those same prisoners had already proven they could work hard and live peacefully. Applications slowly turned into visas, and one by one, ships that had once carried prisoners out returned them as immigrants. In the small towns that had hosted camps, familiar faces began to reappear. Karl Becker, the Bavarian stonemason, stepped off a Greyhound bus carrying only a duffel bag and a letter of sponsorship from the rancher who had once guarded him. Another man, Anton Weiss, returned to Oklahoma to marry a woman he had met at a church social held beside the camp fence. In Georgia, 2 former Italian prisoners bought a bakery together and filled it with recipes from their villages, bread and biscotti, that reminded locals why kindness matters. For the communities, it was at first strange. Neighbors whispered, "He used to be one of them." But familiarity softened suspicion. The men painted barns, fixed tractors, and brought discipline learned on military drill fields to their new jobs. They joined harvest festivals, sent their children to local schools, knelt in the same pews. Soon, the phrase "the Germans" disappeared from talk. People simply called them by name. They brought pieces of Europe with them, the way to mend a gate with precision, the patience to craft stone walls, the songs sung at dusk after work. And in return, they embraced American habits with genuine affection. Cold Coca-Cola bottles after labor, baseball on the radio, the rhythm of small-town freedom. By the early 1950s, hundreds of former prisoners had settled permanently across the United States. Some became citizens. Many never spoke much about the war again. To them, what mattered wasn't politics, it was belonging. One newspaper headline captured it best: "Enemies yesterday, neighbors today." The barbed wire that once divided them had rusted away, replaced by fences meant only to keep in cattle. And where guard towers once stood, the sound that now carried over the fields was laughter. Time, like the wind over those old fields, eventually erased the fences. By the 1960s, most of the camps that once dotted the United States were gone, torn down, paved over, or swallowed by corn and wheat. But if you drive through the same towns today, a handful of clues remain. A stone wall built by prisoners who stayed, a bakery that still carries a German surname above the door, a church pew with initials quietly carved into its backrest, left there by someone who was once called an enemy. The generation that lived through it remembered the story differently than the headlines. For them, the war had ended not on some distant battlefield, but right here in their own backyards when strangers stopped being strangers. Former prisoners became citizens, homeowners, fathers of American children. They married locals, started small businesses, and sometimes went decades before revealing that they had once lived behind wire. Their accents softened. Their memories did too. At community picnics and town meetings, it no longer mattered who had worn which uniform. Only the shared story mattered, the one about how people met when the rest of the world was tearing itself apart. Their letters to Europe told a simple truth, that the America they had seen from behind fences was not built on hatred or revenge, but on rebuilding. And for many, that idea was worth crossing an ocean twice. Archivists still find postcards in attics and boxes marked Camp 41 Friends. In polite, careful English, they all say some version of the same thing. Thank you. We were prisoners, but you made us human again. The children and grandchildren of those men rarely knew the full story until years later. They discovered old photos of their fathers, standing beside tractors or shaking hands with farmers who helped them stay. Some traveled to the ruins of former camps to place small flags, not German, not American, just white cloth for peace. Historians like to measure wars by the nations that win or lose. But perhaps history's quieter triumphs are measured by something smaller, the way people refused to keep their hatred once the guns went silent. In the end, the story of those prisoners who chose to stay behind is not about captivity at all. It's about what happens when compassion passes between former enemies and grows roots in the same soil, from captives to neighbors. Proof that even after the worst of wars, humanity can still choose to start over,